The morning they brought me to the palace, it was raining. Not the soft kind of rain that whispers against window panes and makes you feel poetic about your life. This was the brutal, indifferent kind. Sheets of cold water that flattened my blonde braid against my neck and soaked through my gray cloak before the iron gates had even finished opening. I stood in the courtyard with mud on my boots and water dripping from the hem of my dress, and I thought, this is exactly the right weather for this. Because I had not been sent here as a gift. I had been sent here as a solution to a problem no one else wanted to solve. 3 weeks ago, a messenger had arrived at the border village of Dunwall, my village, carrying a royal decree sealed in black wax. The Alpha King required a mate. The selection had been conducted across all 11 packs of the Northern Territory, and after every family of standing had submitted their daughters for consideration, after every pretty face and strong bloodline had been assessed and catalogued and found acceptable, the King's Council had made their final declaration. They needed an Omega. Not just any Omega. A true one. Rare, they said. Stabilizing. The kind of presence that could quiet a war room when the alphas inside it were minutes from tearing each other apart. The kind of woman whose nature worked like gravity. Not loud, not powerful in the conventional sense, but foundational. My pack elder had looked at me across his cluttered desk with something between pity and relief. Elsie, he'd said carefully, you are the only unmated Omega of age in Dunwall. He did not say congratulations. He did not say you should be honored. He folded his hands on the desk and watched me with the expression of a man delivering news about the weather. Something unfortunate that no one could help. I had not cried. I had not argued. I had packed one bag, said goodbye to the small herb garden I kept behind my cottage, and walked to the road where the royal carriage was already waiting. The driver had not helped me with my bag. The 2 guards flanking the carriage had not acknowledged me beyond a brief, sweeping look that landed somewhere between assessment and dismissal. I had not imagined they would. I was not the kind of woman men rushed to assist. I was 23 years old, unremarkable in the way that people describe a field in winter. Functional, present, not particularly interesting to look at. My hair was the pale gold of old straw. My eyes a quiet gray-green that tended to disappear in any room with stronger colors in it. I was not small enough to be delicate, or tall enough to be striking. I existed in the comfortable middle distance of most people's attention spans, noticed when useful and overlooked when not. That had suited me, for most of my life. It did not seem like it would suit me here. The Palace of the Iron Crest was enormous in the way that things built to intimidate are always enormous. All dark stone and sharp angles, towers that cut upward into the gray sky like accusations. The courtyard was filled with wolves even in the rain. Guards in leather armor standing at rigid attention. Servants moving with the quick, purposeful efficiency of people who had learned that hesitation was expensive. Everything smelled of pine resin, iron, and something older underneath. An ancient alpha dominance that pressed against my Omega nature like a hand flat against my sternum. I breathed through it. I kept walking. A woman met me at the top of the stone steps. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and the kind of posture that suggested she had been born standing at attention. She looked at me with sharp dark eyes, and did not bother disguising her assessment. You are Elsie of Dunwall, she said. It was not a question. Yes. I am Myron, head of the king's household. She paused. Her gaze moved over me once more, the wet cloak, the muddy boots, the single bag. Something shifted in her expression. Not cruelty exactly, but not warmth either. You were not what the council described. I tilted my head slightly. What did they describe? Marin's mouth pressed into a thin, complicated line. Someone less. Composed. She turned briskly. Come, I'll show you to your rooms. The king will not receive you today. I followed her through corridors of dark wood paneling and iron sconces, past tapestries depicting battles I didn't know the names of, and wolves midshift in scenes of ancient war. The palace was alive with quiet, controlled activity. Maids carrying linens, 2 young warriors arguing in low voices near a window, an elderly advisor hurrying past with a stack of scrolls under one arm and no awareness of anyone around him. No one looked at me. I was already furniture. My rooms were in the east wing, away from the main hall. They were not unkind rooms. A wide bed with heavy wool blankets, a writing desk near the window, a fireplace that Marin lit with practiced efficiency. But they were clearly not the rooms of someone expected to matter. They were comfortable in the way of spaces designed to keep someone contained without technically being a cell. I set my bag down on the bed and went to the window. From there, I could see the training yard below, a wide rectangle of packed earth where a group of warriors were sparring in the rain with the cheerful disregard for discomfort that seemed to be the palace's unofficial culture. 2 of them were laughing about something. A third was demonstrating a hold to a younger trainee, walking him through the motion with patient repetition. And at the far edge of the yard, alone, stood a man who was not sparring with anyone. He stood with his back to the palace, facing the tree line beyond the yard's boundary wall. He wore no cloak despite the rain. Dark braids ran down his back, wet against black leather armor, and even from 3 floors up and half a courtyard away, the weight of his presence was something I could feel. Not hear, not see exactly, but feel. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. I knew who he was without being told. Alpha King Xander did not move. He stood absolutely still in the pouring rain, staring at the tree line, and something in the set of his shoulders, the precise, rigid containment of them, made my chest do something unexpected. He did not look like a man who had won. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't cross. And then, as if he'd heard that thought, he turned. Not toward the yard, not toward the palace, directly up, directly at the window where I was standing. I did not step back. I don't know why. Every sensible instinct I had said to move, to disappear into the room's shadows the way I had learned to disappear in every room I'd ever occupied. But I stood there in the gray window light with my wet braid over one shoulder and my hands still at my sides. And for 3 full seconds, across the entire distance of rain and stone and rank and expectation, Alpha King Xander looked at me. His expression did not change, but something in it, some quality of the stillness, shifted. Then Marin knocked on the door behind me and said dinner would be brought to my rooms, and by the time I turned back to the window, the yard was empty. He was gone. I pressed my fingers to the cold glass and held a breath I hadn't realized I'd been keeping. Something just changed, I thought. I don't know what. But something did. I did not sleep well that first night. The palace had its own sounds. Deep settling groans from the stone walls, the distant rhythm of guards changing shifts, wind moving through corridors in ways that suggested the building had opinions about the weather. I lay in the wide bed with its heavy blankets and stared at the ceiling and listened to all of it, cataloging each sound the way I had always cataloged unfamiliar environments, building a map of the place through noise alone. Back in Dunwall, my cottage had been small enough that I could hear everything from anywhere. Rain on the roof, the neighbor's dog, the particular creak of my front door that told me exactly how hard the wind was blowing. Here, the scale was different. The silence between sounds was longer, heavier. The palace did not breathe the way a small house breathed. It kept its secrets in its walls, and only released them in fragments, late at night, when it thought no one was paying attention. I was always paying attention. By the time gray dawn light began pressing through the curtains, I had given up on sleep entirely. I dressed quietly, braided my pale hair, and slipped out of my rooms before any servant arrived to manage me. The corridors were nearly empty at that hour. One guard nodded at me from his post, acknowledging my existence with the minimum effort required, and a kitchen girl carrying a basket of bread glanced up and then away again, with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned not to notice things that weren't her business. I moved through the east wing and followed the smell of cold stone and pine until I found a side door that opened onto a narrow garden tucked against the palace's eastern wall. It was not a grand garden. It had none of the formal, architectural ambition of the grounds I'd glimpsed from my window. This was an older space, a long rectangle of raised beds and climbing trellises that had clearly been tended once and then gradually abandoned, taken back by whatever wanted to grow there without instruction. Dried lavender stalks still stood in rigid rows in one bed. Something that might have been sage, or might have been years of determined weeds, had colonized another completely. Against the far wall, a climbing rose had escaped its trellis entirely and was doing exactly as it pleased across 6 feet of old stone. I stepped inside and felt my shoulders drop by about 2 inches. This was a language I knew. I crouched beside the nearest raised bed and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. Cold, dense, waterlogged from yesterday's rain, but underneath that, darker and richer than I'd expected. Good bones, my instincts said. Neglected, not ruined. No one uses that garden. The voice came from behind me, and I stood up faster than I intended, turning with my heart doing something undignified against my ribs. A young man leaned against the doorframe I'd just come through, perhaps 19, lanky in the way of someone still growing into his height, with a guard's uniform that fit him slightly too loosely, and dark hair that fell over his forehead with cheerful disregard for formality. He had an open, curious face, and the relaxed posture of someone who hadn't yet learned to be guarded around strangers. Hasn't been touched in about 3 years, he continued, nodding at the garden, since the head groundskeeper retired and no one replaced him properly. I noticed, I said. He studied me with uncomplicated interest. You're her. The Omega they brought from Dunwall. Elsie, I said. Cade. He pushed off the doorframe and came to stand at the edge of the first bed, looking down at the sad lavender stalks with the same expression he might have used for a moderately interesting puzzle. I'm one of the King's junior guards, 3rd rotation, which mostly means I stand in corridors for 6 hours and try not to fall asleep. He paused. Do you actually know about plants, or were you just crouching there for something to do? Both, I said honestly. He laughed. It was a good laugh. Uncalculated, genuine. The kind that made you want to earn it again. Over the following hour, while the palace woke up around us and the sky shifted from gray to a pale, watery blue, Cade told me things that no official briefing would have mentioned. He had that quality that young people who are naturally kind and not yet politically careful often have. A willingness to simply tell you things without calculating the advantage in it first. He told me the names of the King's 4 senior advisors, and which 2 of them genuinely hated each other. He told me that the Great Hall was coldest in the northwest corner, and warmest near the 3rd pillar from the left, which mattered if you were going to be standing in it for long periods. He told me that the kitchen produced extraordinary bread on Tuesdays, because the head baker only worked Mondays and Tuesdays, and the rest of the week was managed by her assistant, who was competent, but not extraordinary. He also told me, with the careful, sideways delicacy of someone conveying important information in an unofficial capacity, that the King's Council had not been pleased with the Dunwall selection. They wanted someone from one of the 5 main packs, Cade said, pulling a dead lavender stalk out of the ground with idle hands. Stronger political connections. They had 3 candidates lined up, daughters of pack leaders, the kind of match that comes with alliances and trade agreements and all of that. He turned the dried stalk between his fingers. The king overruled them. I went still. He chose Dunwall specifically? Cade glanced at me sideways. He chose Omega specifically. Said the pack politics were the problem, not the solution. And if he was going to take a mate, he was going to take one who didn't come with a faction already attached to her. He paused. The council was furious. They're still furious, if I'm being honest. Another pause. I probably shouldn't have told you that. Probably not, I agreed. But I'm glad you did. He smiled at that, unrepentant. I turned the information over in my mind as I walked the rest of the garden's length. Xander had chosen this, not chosen me. He didn't know me. and I held no illusions about that. But he had chosen the shape of this arrangement deliberately, strategically, over the objections of the people around him. That was not the act of a man simply following tradition. That was a man trying to solve something. The question was what? I was still thinking about it 2 hours later, when Marin found me in the garden, with my sleeves rolled up and soil on my hands, having made an executive decision about the state of the neglected beds that probably no one had authorized me to make. She stood at the garden entrance and looked at me for a long moment. "The king will receive you this morning," she said. "In 1 hour." Her gaze moved to my hands. "You should wash." "Yes," I agreed. "Elsie." She paused, and something in her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more careful. "The king is not a simple man to read. Do not mistake his silence for indifference, and do not mistake his directness for cruelty." She seemed to weigh something internally. "He has been alone for a long time, longer than people realize." I looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me that?" Marin's expression did something complicated. "Because you did not flinch when I told you that you weren't what the council described," she said. "Most women would have asked what was wrong with them. You asked what they'd been told." She turned to leave. "That is either foolish or interesting. I haven't decided which." She left before I could respond. I stood in the neglected garden with dirty hands and thought about a man standing alone in the rain, staring at a tree line he couldn't cross. I thought about a king who had overruled his entire council to avoid a political match. I thought about long corridors and heavy silences, and a palace that kept its secrets in its walls. He has been alone for a long time. An hour later, clean and composed, I knocked on the door of the king's study. The guard outside opened it without a word. The room was large and lived in. Maps across every surface. Books stacked with the organized chaos of someone who actually read them rather than displayed them. 2 iron candelabras burning low. It smelled of leather and ink, and something woodsy underneath, dark and grounding. Xander stood at the far window with his back to me. He was exactly as he had appeared from 3 floors up, massive in the quiet way of things that don't need to announce themselves. Dark braids falling between his shoulders, leather armor worn with the ease of a second skin. The faint scar along his jaw was more visible at this distance. His hands were clasped behind his back. He did not turn when I entered. The silence stretched for 10 full seconds. I did not fill it. Then he said, without moving, "You were watching me from the east window yesterday." His voice was low and unhurried. Not a question. "Yes," I said. Another silence. Then he turned. His eyes were a pale, startling blue, the kind of blue that exists in deep winter, right before dark. They moved over me with an assessment that was different from every other assessment I'd received since arriving. Not cataloging my adequacy, not measuring my usefulness. Something more considered than that. Something that seemed to be looking for a specific answer to a specific question. Whatever he found, or didn't find, made something in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with the faint quality of someone noticing an anomaly they hadn't accounted for. "Should I be?" I asked. The pale blue eyes held mine for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. "Everyone is," he said simply. He did not invite me to sit. I sat anyway, not defiantly. I want to be clear about that. I chose the chair nearest the window with the same quiet practicality I would have chosen it anywhere else, because my feet hurt from standing on stone floors since dawn, and because nothing in my body believed that remaining upright while he decided what to make of me would improve either of our situations. I folded my hands in my lap and waited with what I hoped was the expression of someone who had simply made a reasonable decision about furniture. Xander watched me do this. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Less testing, more uncertain. Like he had prepared for several versions of this meeting and I had just introduced a variable that wasn't on his list. "You came from Dunwall," he said finally. He moved from the window to the desk, not sitting behind it, but standing at its edge with his arms crossed, unconsciously defensive, I noted, for a man who was supposedly feared by everyone in his kingdom. Yes. Small pack. Border territory. He glanced at a document on the desk. My file, presumably, thin as it was. No political ties. No family alliances of consequence. Correct. You're a healer. Among other things. I paused. I also keep a garden, manage accounts reasonably well, and can identify 37 varieties of edible plant by smell alone, which has been more useful than you might expect. I kept my voice level. I'm told the council found my qualifications underwhelming. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, present for about half a second before discipline extinguished it. The council finds most things underwhelming, he said. It's their primary function. I looked at him directly. Why Dunwall? Why an Omega with no connections? He was quiet for a moment. The low candles in the room shifted in a draft from somewhere, throwing the angles of his face into brief contrast. The strong jaw, the careful eyes, the faint weariness that lived underneath the controlled exterior like water under ice. Because I'm tired, he said, of every person in this palace having a reason to be here that has nothing to do with me. It was the most honest thing I had heard since arriving. It landed in the room with a particular weight, the way very honest things do, taking up more space than their words should, filling the quiet around them with resonance. I did not look away from him. That's a lonely way to run a kingdom. He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved. I should tell you, I continued, that I have no intention of pretending. I don't know you. You don't know me. Whatever the council or the decree or the tradition requires us to be, I think we'd both be wasting each other's time performing it. I kept my voice even, unhurried, the same tone I used when I was explaining something difficult to a frightened patient back in Dunwall. I'm willing to be here honestly, if that means anything to you, but I won't be a decoration. The pale blue eyes studied me for a long moment. You're not what I expected, he said. So I've been told. I met his gaze. What did you expect? He unfolded his arms and turned back toward the window, not dismissively, but with the quality of someone who needed a moment to put something back in order internally. Someone quieter, he said at last. I am quiet, I said. I'm just not silent. This time the corner of his mouth moved and stayed moved, just briefly. A fraction of expression that felt, in that austere room with its maps and its candles and its weight of authority, like something unexpectedly rare. He dismissed me after that. Politely but clearly. The audience was over. I rose, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door. Elsie. I turned. He was still facing the window, his back to me. The East Garden, he said. Do what you want with it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. I was not, as I had half expected, installed into formal court life. Presented at dinners, paraded through functions, displayed as evidence of the king's mating selection. The council clearly would have preferred that. I heard it in the way they spoke around me when I appeared in the great hall for meals, their voices carrying the particular quality of complaints being managed rather than voiced. Elder Soren, the eldest of the 4 senior advisors, white-haired and precise and constitutionally opposed to anything that hadn't been done before, watched me with barely disguised irritation every time I entered a room. I was not performing well as a symbol. Symbols were meant to be seen. I spent most of my time in the East Garden. Within the first week, I had cleared the waterlogged beds and turned the soil. Within 10 days, I had sent a carefully worded request to the kitchen stores for seeds, practical ones, medicinal and culinary both, and received them via Marin with a note that said only the head cook approves in her economical handwriting. By the end of the second week, the climbing rose had been gently redirected back toward its trellis. The sage beds were cleared and replanted, and Cade had taken to stopping by on his off-rotation hours to hand me tools and ask questions about plants with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had found an unexpected hobby. He brought others, eventually. First, a kitchen girl named Petra, 16, freckled, determinedly cheerful, who had heard there was fresh lavender growing and wanted to see it. Then 2 of the younger warriors from the training yard who had been set to light duties following minor injuries and had been sent by their captain to do something useful while they healed. Then, somewhat surprisingly, the elderly advisor with the scrolls I had seen on my first day, who turned out to be called Aldrich, and who had apparently maintained a private interest in herbalism for 40 years, without anyone in the palace being aware of it. They came for different reasons. They stayed because the garden was, I was slowly understanding, the only place in the Iron Crest where no one was required to be anything in particular. I didn't plan it that way, but I recognized it when it happened. Xander and I did not meet formally again during those weeks, but I became aware of him in the way you become aware of weather, through evidence rather than direct observation. A map moved from the Great Hall to a room closer to my corridor, suggesting changed patterns of movement. Marin mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone passing on information they wanted passed on, that the king had canceled 2 council meetings in favor of extended rides through the northern forest. Cade told me, while helping me stake a row of climbing beans, that the king had been sleeping better, and then looked immediately as if he hadn't intended to say that. "How would you know that?" I asked. "Third rotation," Cade said, with the dignity of someone pretending not to have just revealed something significant. "We notice things." I pressed the information flat in my mind and planted the next stake. 3 weeks after my arrival, I was crossing the upper corridor near the library when I nearly walked directly into Xander, coming around the corner from the opposite direction. We both stopped. The corridor was narrow, the morning light coming sideways through the tall windows, and at this distance, 4 feet, maybe 5. The weight of his presence was something I felt in my sternum, the way I'd felt it in the courtyard on the first day, but closer now, and different. Less like pressure, more like warmth. He was carrying a book. The detail struck me as unexpectedly humanizing. "You've been working in the East Garden," he said. Not an accusation, not a compliment. An observation offered with the particular quality of someone who had been watching something develop from a distance and was now acknowledging it directly. "You said I could," I pointed out. "I did." He glanced down at the book in his hand, then back at me. Something in his expression was doing something careful. "The kitchen tells me you've been using the stores, medicinal plants, and culinary. The cook has opinions about rosemary. She has opinions about everything." The ghost of that almost smile again. "People are talking about it. The garden." I waited. "They say it's the first place in this palace that doesn't feel like a place where something is about to go wrong," he said. The words were delivered with such flat honesty that it took me a moment to understand what he was actually saying, what it cost him maybe to say it. I looked at him in the sideways morning light. This enormous, guarded, quietly exhausted man standing in a corridor with a book, telling me in his oblique, careful way that something I had done had mattered. "Walk with me," I said. "I want to show you what the sage beds look like now." He looked at me for a moment. Then he tucked the book under his arm. "All right," he said, and we walked. The trouble started on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because the kitchen had produced extraordinary bread that morning, the head baker's doing just as Cade had promised. And I had brought a small loaf out to the garden where Aldrich was explaining the difference between common time and wild time to Petra with the focused intensity of a man who had waited 40 years for someone to ask. The morning was cold but clear, the kind of autumn clarity that makes everything look sharp-edged and slightly too real. And I had been thinking, quietly, and without examining it too closely, that for the first time since arriving at the Iron Crest, something in my chest had stopped bracing for impact. Then Marin appeared at the garden entrance with her formal expression on, the one that meant something official was happening, and said that Elder Soren had requested my presence in the council chamber. Not the king, the council. I set down the bread. Petra looked at me with large eyes. Aldrich's hands went still on his time. Now? I asked. Yes, said Marin. And then, very quietly, so only I could hear, be careful. The council chamber was everything the garden was not. A long room of dark stone and high ceilings, the kind of architecture designed to make individuals feel appropriately small. 4 senior advisors seated at a curved table, and Elder Soren standing at its center, white-haired, precise, wearing his authority with the comfort of someone who had never once questioned whether it belonged to him. The other 3 were less memorable individually, but functioned collectively as a single organism of institutional opinion. Harvin, broad and watchful. Kress, young for an advisor and therefore twice as rigid. And Davon, who had the quality of a man perpetually waiting for someone more important to speak first. There was no chair for me on my side of the table. I stood. Elsie of Dunwall, Soren said. His voice was the kind that had spent decades being listened to. Thank you for coming. He did not mean thank you. He meant we have decided to do this and your compliance was assumed. Of course, I said pleasantly. Soren folded his hands on the table. We wished to speak with you regarding your role here at the Iron Crest, specifically regarding certain concerns that have arisen among the council about the nature of your integration into palace life. I kept my expression open and attentive. What concerns? You have, he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words for maximum effect, made yourself rather conspicuous. For someone brought here in a supporting capacity. He let the phrase land. Supporting capacity. The garden, while harmless in itself, has become something of a gathering point. Palace staff, junior guards, members of the advisory staff. He glanced at the table. At Aldrich's empty chair, I realized. It has created an informal social structure that was not sanctioned. People enjoying a garden, I said. People congregating outside of established channels, Soren corrected. In a palace where hierarchy and structure maintain order, informal structures create complications. He paused. Additionally, it has come to our attention that you have had private meetings with the king. I walked with him once, I said. In the garden I was given permission to maintain. He invited himself. Soren's eyes sharpened. The king's time and attention are significant resources. It is the council's responsibility to ensure they are directed appropriately. He leaned forward very slightly. You must understand, Elsie, that the role you were brought here to fill is a specific one. Stabilizing. Quiet. The Omega function, as it has been understood for generations, is to support the Alpha's leadership, not to accumulate independent influence within the court. There it was. I had been wondering how long it would take them to say it plainly. It had taken 3 weeks and a loaf of bread. I looked at Soren steadily. You're asking me to be less present. I am asking you, he said, with the smooth finality of someone issuing an instruction dressed as a request, to remember your function. The room was very quiet. The other 3 advisors were watching me with various expressions. Harvin guarded, Kress satisfied, Davin still waiting for someone else to define the moment for him. I thought about the garden. About Petra asking questions with her whole body leaning forward. About Aldrich talking about time like it was a language he had kept secret inside himself for decades. About Cade laughing at something I'd said about soil acidity. About Xander standing next to the climbing rose with his book tucked under his arm. Looking at the green things growing out of neglected ground, with an expression I hadn't been able to name, but hadn't been able to stop thinking about. I'll take that under consideration, I said. Soren nodded, satisfied. I walked back to the garden and spent the rest of the morning being very, very still on the outside while everything on the inside moved quickly. Xander found me there that afternoon. He came alone, which was unusual enough that I looked up immediately when I heard the gate. He was not in armor. A simpler dark shirt, sleeves pushed up, the kind of clothing that suggested he had come here directly from something private. He looked at me, and then at the expression I hadn't quite managed to smooth away yet. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. "The council called me in this morning." His jaw tightened. "Soren." He was kind enough to explain my function to me. I kept my voice even. Apparently, gardens are politically destabilizing. The stillness that came over Xander then was different from his usual contained quiet. It had an edge to it, something that moved beneath the surface of his composure, the way deep water moves beneath ice. "What exactly did he say?" I told him. Precisely, without embellishment, the way I gave information when I wanted it to be heard clearly. I watched his expression as I spoke, the controlled neutrality of it, and underneath that, something that had weight and heat and was being held very deliberately in check. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I apologize," he said. "That meeting should not have happened." "It happened because they're afraid," I said, "not of me specifically, of the fact that you made a choice they didn't control." I looked at him directly. "They don't know what to do with a mate they didn't select. They can't calculate my allegiances because I don't have any yet. That frightens people like Soren more than an enemy they can name." Xander looked at me with the particular expression I had been trying to decode for 3 weeks. That deep, assessing look that seemed to be searching for something specific. "You're not angry." "I'm very angry," I said calmly. "I'm just more interested in understanding the problem than expressing the anger." He exhaled, a short, quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but carried some of its texture. He moved to the bench at the garden's far end and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a very large man remembering that not everything is built to his scale. After a moment's hesitation, I sat beside him. We were quiet for a while. The rows above us moved in the light wind. Somewhere in the palace, a bell rang the afternoon hour. "The council has been running this kingdom for 11 years, he said finally, "since before I was old enough to overrule them effectively." He turned the words over carefully. "I have spent 11 years learning which battles to choose, learning when to hold still and when to move." He paused. "I am not good at asking for help. I was taught that needing it was a kind of failure." "Who taught you that?" I asked. He said nothing, but his eyes went to the middle distance, and something in them was old and tired and very alone. "Whoever taught you that," I said quietly, "was wrong." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said in a space that hasn't held much truth, and the space needs a moment to adjust. Xander looked at his hands. Scarred, strong hands, resting on his knees with the stillness of someone who has learned to keep very careful control of every part of themselves. "There are 3 pack leaders arriving next week," he said. "A summit. The northern borders have been contested for months, 2 packs pushing against the boundary lines, 1 mediating badly." He glanced at me sideways. "The council wants me to resolve it with a show of dominance, assert rank, establish consequences, end the dispute through fear." "And you?" I asked. "I think that resolves the symptom and makes the disease worse." He turned to look at me fully. "These are 3 leaders who have been talking past each other for 6 months, because none of them trust the same language. They need—" He stopped. "Someone who isn't a faction," I said slowly. "Someone with no allegiance to any of the 3 positions." I looked at him. "You want me in that room?" "I want you in that room," he confirmed. "Not as decoration. Not as the Omega mate performing her stabilizing function for the council's satisfaction." His voice was even, but something underneath it was careful and deliberate. "I want you there because in 3 weeks I have watched you walk into every room in this palace and leave it different than you found it, without once raising your voice or asserting your rank." He paused. That is not a small thing, Elsie. The late afternoon light was golden across the garden. The rose on the wall was the deep red of something that had survived 3 years of neglect and grown stronger for it. Somewhere nearby, Petra was humming to herself, unaware that anything was happening. I thought about Soren telling me to remember my function. I thought about what Xander was offering, not in place of that instruction, but in direct contradiction to it. "All right," I said. He exhaled again, that quiet, almost laugh, but longer this time, more like relief. "They arrive Thursday," he said. "Then I have 2 days to learn everything about them," I said. "I'll need files. Whatever the council has. And Aldrich, he's been here long enough to know things that aren't written down." Xander looked at me with something in his expression that had no guard over it at all. Just for a moment. Something open and startled and oddly young. "You're already planning," he said. "I'm always planning," I said. "I'm just usually doing it quietly enough that people don't notice." This time, the smile arrived completely. The 3 pack leaders arrived on a gray Thursday morning with their retinues and their grievances, and the particular energy of men who had been angry for so long they had forgotten what the original argument was actually about. I watched them arrive from the upper corridor window, the same window where I had first seen Xander standing in the rain. Alpha Brennan of the Northfall pack came first. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a silver-streaked beard and the careful, deliberate movements of someone managing a temper he had long since stopped pretending wasn't there. Behind him, Alpha Cormac of the Ridgeline pack. Younger, sharper, with the restless energy of someone who had something to prove and hadn't yet figured out to whom. And last, Alpha Wren of the Greywood, the mediator, a lean woman of 40 with watchful eyes and the exhausted expression of someone who had been trying to hold 2 walls apart with her bare hands for 6 months. I had spent 2 days reading everything Aldrich could find and listening to everything he couldn't write down. The dispute was territorial on the surface. Boundary lines, grazing rights, a river crossing that both Northfall and Ridgeline claimed. But underneath that, underneath all of it, was something simpler and harder to resolve. Brennan felt disrespected by a decision made 2 years ago that had never been properly acknowledged. Cormac had inherited his position from a father who had made promises Cormac couldn't keep without losing face. Wren had been trying to resolve it without understanding that the problem wasn't the boundary lines at all. "It's a grief problem," I had told Xander the night before, sitting in the library with Aldrich's files spread across the table between us. "Brennan lost something. Status, recognition, and he has been waiting 2 years for someone to acknowledge it. Cormac is drowning in his father's legacy and can't admit it. Wren is mediating the wrong conflict." Xander had looked at me across the table. The candles were low. Outside, the wind was moving through the courtyard. "And how do you resolve a grief problem?" "You name it," I said simply. "In a room where it's safe to be named." He had been quiet for a moment. "The council will hate that approach." "The council's approach hasn't worked for 6 months," I said. The summit meeting was held in the Great Hall, which Marin had arranged with the formal precision the occasion required. The long table, the carved chairs, the iron candelabras. Elder Soren and his council sat along one side. The 3 pack leaders and their seconds sat along the other. Xander sat at the table's head, in the high-backed chair that was not quite a throne but functioned as one. I sat beside him. Soren's expression when I took that seat was a study in controlled displeasure. He had expected me in the background, present as a formality, silent as a piece of furniture. I had chosen the chair to Xander's right, with the same quiet practicality with which I had chosen every chair since arriving, and I folded my hands on the table and looked at the 3 pack leaders with the open, attentive expression of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were going to say. Alpha Brennan noticed me immediately. His eyes moved to me with the assessing quality of a man recalculating the room's dynamics. Cormac looked at Xander with barely concealed challenge. Wren looked at me with something more like curiosity. Xander opened the meeting with the kind of clean, direct language he used when he wasn't performing authority, but simply exercising it, stating the purpose, establishing the stakes, making clear that the summit was meant to produce resolution rather than renegotiate positions. He was good at that. I had come to understand that his silence was not emptiness, but compression. That when he chose to speak, the words carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. For the first hour, the meeting went as predicted. Cormac stated his position with the barely managed aggression of someone performing strength for an audience. Brennan listened with the carefully composed expression of a man who had made up his mind before arriving. Wren attempted twice to redirect the conversation toward practical compromise and was talked past both times. Soren looked increasingly satisfied with the proceedings, in the way that men who expect things to fail look satisfied when things begin failing. I waited. The moment came when Cormac finished a long, detailed argument about the river crossing rights, and Brennan simply said, with absolute quiet, "That crossing has carried Northfall Pack's mark for 40 years. My father built the bridge. His father before him maintained the road." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "That is not a boundary dispute. That is something else." The room went still. I said, quietly and clearly, "Alpha Brennan, what was the decision 2 years ago that changed the status of that crossing?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a very obvious question has somehow gone unasked for a very long time. Brennan looked at me. His expression shifted, the defensive armor of it loosening, just slightly, at the unexpected directness. "The Northern Territory reassignment," he said carefully. "The Council's ruling. It reclassified the crossing as a shared resource without..." He stopped. "Without acknowledgement of Northfall's prior claim." "Without acknowledgement," I said. "Not compensation, not negotiation. Acknowledgement." Brennan's eyes held mine for a moment. Something in them was tired and old, and had been waiting a very long time to be heard accurately. "Yes," he said quietly. I turned to Cormac. "And your father's agreement, the one that created the current boundary line. What did he promise Northfall in exchange for the reclassification?" Cormac went very still. Around him, his second shifted uncomfortably. "He promised," Cormac said at last, with the careful tone of a man handling something fragile, "formal recognition of Northfall's historical claim. A record in the treaty archive." He paused. It was never entered. The room was quiet. I looked at Wren. "You've been trying to resolve a boundary dispute," I said gently. "But this was never about the boundary." Wren looked at me for a long moment. Then something in her expression changed. A release of 6 months of accumulated, misdirected effort. "No," she said. "It wasn't." What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic. It was not a triumph or a confrontation. It was a conversation, the kind that happens when the actual problem has finally been named in a room where everyone can hear it. Soren attempted twice to redirect toward formal legal frameworks. Both times, Xander let the attempt land, and then said nothing, and the silence drew the room back to the table, to the real work. By the time the afternoon light had shifted to the long gold of early evening, there was an agreement, not a perfect one. Cormac would need to formally enter his father's promise into the treaty archive, a small humiliation for a young alpha still managing his inheritance. Brennan would receive the acknowledgement that had been owed for 2 years, carried in Xander's own hand in a letter that would be read before both packs. Wren would mediate the remaining technical boundary details with both parties present and a clear record kept. It was not a solution built on dominance or fear. It was a solution built on the simple, radical act of someone finally listening accurately. As the leaders and their retinues were led to their guest quarters, Soren approached me in the corridor outside the Great Hall. His expression was not angry. It was something more complex than that. A man reassessing something he had been certain of, doing the reassessment with the discomfort of someone unused to the exercise. "You did not speak much," he said. "I didn't need to," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "The council underestimated you." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." He nodded. once stiffly, the closest he was constitutionally capable of coming to acknowledgement. Then he walked away down the corridor with the measured step of a man choosing his next position carefully. Xander found me in the garden that evening. The last of the autumn light was moving across the climbing rose, which had come into a late, stubborn second bloom. Small red flowers pushing out of wood that should have been done for the season, unreasonable and determined and entirely beautiful. I was sitting on the bench watching them when he came through the gate and sat beside me without saying anything for a long, comfortable moment. "Soren will adjust," he said finally. "He's difficult, not inflexible." "I know," I said. He was quiet. The garden held the particular hush of a place that had been brought back to life, and was now simply living. Somewhere above us in the palace, I could hear Cade laughing at something, the sound floating down through an open window like an afterthought. "I have been thinking," Xander said, "about what you said, that whoever taught me that needing help was failure was wrong." I waited. "My father," he said. Simply and without elaboration, the way people state things they have carried for a long time and have finally decided to put down. He was a good king and a difficult man, and he died before I was ready. He looked at his hands. I have been running this kingdom the way he ran it, alone at the center of it, making every decision from a position of absolute isolation. He paused. It was the only model I had. "And now?" I asked. He looked at me. In the fading evening light, the pale blue of his eyes had shifted to something warmer, the color of sky just after sunset, the last brightness before dark. The scar along his jaw, the lines of tiredness around his eyes, the enormous, careful, slowly unlocking quality of him. I had been watching all of it for nearly a month, and I understood it now the way I understood the garden. Not as a problem to be fixed, but as something with its own nature, its own rhythms, its own stubborn will to keep growing in whatever light was available. "Now," he said quietly, "I have a different model." I held his gaze. Something in my chest had stopped bracing a long time ago, I realized. I hadn't noticed exactly when it happened. "The rose came back," I said, nodding toward it. "It shouldn't have. It's too late in the season. But it did anyway." Xander looked at the small red flowers for a moment, then back at me. "Things that have survived neglect," he said slowly, "tend to be stronger than things that were always tended." I smiled at that. We stayed in the garden until the light was entirely gone, talking. Not about the summit or the council or the border disputes or the weight of kingdoms. About his father's library and the books he'd actually read, versus the ones he'd displayed. About Dunwall in winter, the way the border frost came in off the mountains and turned everything silver and silent. About Aldrich and his secret 40 years of herbalism, and the expression on his face the first time I'd asked his opinion about soil. About small things and honest things, and the kind of things that two people say when they have stopped performing for each other and are simply present. At some point, without either of us marking it, his hand had found mine on the bench between us. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. Just a quiet, certain arrival. His scarred fingers over mine in the dark, steady as the ground. I did not pull away. In the weeks that followed, the iron crest changed in the slow, undramatic way that things change when their foundations shift. Soren adjusted, as Xander had predicted, cautiously, with the dignity of a man who had decided that adaptation was preferable to irrelevance. The summit agreement held, and then produced 2 further agreements between pacts, who had watched the Northfall resolution and decided that the new approach was worth attempting. The garden expanded into a second set of beds along the southern wall. Petra began a hesitant apprenticeship in medicinal herbs that she attacked with focused, freckled determination. Aldrich finally submitted a formal proposal for a palace herbary that had been sitting in his desk, half-written, for 11 years. Cade was promoted to second rotation. He informed me of this with a formality that lasted about 4 seconds before dissolving into the good, uncalculated laugh. and Xander and I built something in the careful, unhurried way that things are built to last. Conversation by conversation, evening by evening. The slow accumulation of honesty between two people who had both spent too long alone in the center of their own lives. There was no single moment of declaration, no dramatic turning point. There was instead the gradual, certain understanding that we had become necessary to each other in the way that ground and root are necessary. Not by force, not by arrangement, but by the quiet logic of two things that had found their right relationship and grown into it completely. The night Xander formally acknowledged me before the full court, not as the Omega brought from Dunwall, not as the mate the council hadn't chosen, but as his partner in the full weight of that word. Elder Soren stood and offered the formal words of recognition with the expression of a man who had revised his position and was doing so with as much grace as his constitution allowed. I stood beside Xander in the great hall with its iron candles and its dark stone, and its history of battles and negotiations and long silences, and I felt the court's attention settle on me with a quality entirely different from the assessing, dismissive weight of my first day. Not because I had become someone different, but because the room had finally learned to look correctly. Afterward, we went to the garden. It was deep winter by then, the beds turned and resting, the climbing rose bare and dark against the stone wall, waiting with the patient certainty of things that know they will bloom again. The air was sharp and clear, carrying pine and frost and the distant wood smoke of the palace hearths. Xander stood beside me in the cold and looked at the bare rose canes and the turned earth and the long, quiet space of a garden in its resting season. "It doesn't look like much," he said. "It never does," I said. "Until it does." He turned to look at me with those pale winter eyes. Warm now, entirely warm, the ice long since thawed. And I looked back at him with the full, unguarded steadiness of someone who had stopped standing in the middle distance of anyone's attention and had claimed, quietly and completely, her own ground. He brought my hand to his mouth. A simple gesture. A certain one. Outside the garden walls, the kingdom continued, its disputes and its councils and its long, complicated history of things left unacknowledged and things finally named. All of it ongoing, as it always would be. But here, in this small recovered space of living things and honest ground, everything was, at last, exactly where it was meant to be, and we were home.